Welcome to the Accessible Learning Experience, where we help you turn learning barriers into learning opportunities. We are so excited to bring you this episode to wrap up Season 3 of the Accessible Learning Experience podcast, with a discussion of the updated Universal Design for Learning, or UDL guidelines. Universal Design for Learning is the framework CAST has pioneered over the last 40 years to assist educators in optimizing teaching and learning so that it works for everyone. And accessibility is a foundational component of UDL. We are lucky to have with us Jenna and Nicole Tucker-Smith, who have led a community-focused, accessible, and transparent process for ensuring the updated guidelines reflect the best thinking in the field as well as in the research literature. Here is our conversation with Jenna and Nicole. This is such an exciting occasion for us. We are here with Jenna from CAST and Nicole Tucker-Smith to talk about a really important development for the field, really exciting development, which is the UDL guidelines and the coming updates. So let's go ahead and get started with our conversation. And we're going to get started with you, Jenna. We always ask our guests, what brought them into this work? What inspires them with this work? And because our podcast is really focused on accessibility, we like to frame it in the form of this question. What is your accessibility story?
Well, thanks so much for having us, Luis. We're just so excited for this conversation. And I love starting out with this question. And I would say that my accessibility story really starts with my parents. Both of my parents worked in the field of special education and inclusive education. And my sister and I really grew up with a deep respect for individual differences, the importance of accessibility, and a real commitment to inclusive education. So I would say that they're kind of my first models in terms of how we can begin to disrupt ableist beliefs and practices. My mom was a special educator for more than 30 years. She dedicated her entire career to building an inclusive model at her high school. It was really the first inclusive model in her district. And my dad also began as a special educator. That's actually how my parents met, which is a fun little story. And then he took a job in the 80s as a director of a segregated school for students with disabilities. And his very first action was to close that school down and work to make sure to include all of the students in their neighborhood schools. So he really kind of transformed that school now into an organization that offers services to support children and adults with disabilities and their families. So I just kind of grew up with this importance of inclusivity all around me. And my parents really were kind of that inspiration for me. And I think it's kind of funny because kind of growing up, I was thinking, oh, I don't think I want to be a teacher. And I was thinking of all of these other things. And then that's exactly what I wanted to become when the time came. As I started out as a special ed teacher working in an inclusive environment, and then my interest in research just grew and grew in UDL. But I love kind of thinking about those roots and that it really was my parents who inspired me.
That's such a lovely story. That is a family affair with you. We often talk about accessibility from the start. And so with your parents meeting as a result of working in inclusive education, well, talk about from the start.
I love
even
that.
before
Yes.
even before you came about, inclusion was part of your life already. Such a wonderful story. And how about you, Nicole? What is your accessibility story?
Yes, thank you, Luis, for having us here today. I really had to think about this question, what is my accessibility story? Because if I'm honest, when I reflect, school was always easy for me. The school came naturally to me. I excelled. I was always, done quickly. The accessibility challenges came with teachers' expectations of me, mainly in terms of being able to have access to higher order classes, higher level classes. And I remember in third grade, I was playing over at my friend's house, and my friend's mother ran the gifted and talented program for the school district. And when my mom came to pick me up from my friend's house, my friend's mother said, "Why isn't she in the gifted and talented program?" And my mom was like, oh, I don't know, the school, so then my mom asked the school, why isn't she considered for the program? And my teacher responded with, oh, well, her scores were kind of borderline. So we thought it'd be best if she were here. I mean, my scores actually qualified me to be in the program. So then when my mother shared this to the person who's director of the program, she's like, no, this child needs to be in the program. She's like, I'm not even saying my child should be in the program because she's not, but this child needs to be in the program. And I just remember my parents constantly, the school system that I grew up in was very racist, constantly having to advocate for me and my brothers to be considered for those higher level courses. And then as a parent of a neurodiverse child, I have to fight for my child to have proper access and proper accommodations. I often, because I'm a public speaker, I'm asked to speak about advocacy. And I say, okay, that's fine, but why should we have to self advocate for a right? And so that's been part of my accessibility story.
Thank you so much for sharing, Nicole. And I think you've both brought up with issue that I think we're going to get into as we go forward in our conversation here of the need to disrupt the isms. I think, Jenna, you mentioned disrupting ableism, and Nicole, you mentioned like racism, right? And so we need to do that hard work, have those hard conversations, disrupt those isms, and then UDL can be a tool for us to have those conversations in a way that everybody can participate in them, which is what makes me so excited about this update to the UDL guidelines, because that's exactly what we're doing. Is we're disrupting the field once again. It's something that we do at CAST for the better. And so I want to just get started on that conversation about the upcoming updates to the UDL guidelines. And so I want to start with you, Jenna. Why update the UDL guidelines and why now?
We are just so excited to have launched this process, and it just felt like the time was right to continue to iterate on the guidelines. That from the very start, we launched the guidelines back in 2008, and we knew that they were going to hopefully become this living and dynamic tool. We even named intentionally that very first version of the guidelines, version 1.0, because we just had this vision and hope of continually updating the guidelines based on new research and based on feedback from the field. And we were kind of learning from members of the UDL community that we needed to do some work in terms of expanding the guidelines, that over the years, the guidelines had become a really important tool for increasing access, but there was more work to be done. And there was a very strong call from practitioners as well as researchers to prompt us to bring a stronger equity lens to the expansion of the guidelines and to think about how we could more fully develop the guidelines to support the design of more equitable and more inclusive spaces. And I think this was our response to that really strong call, and recognizing there was so much more we could do in order to make the UDL guidelines a tool that could support more educators, more practitioners, more researchers, more learners. So we had kind of that inspiration from both practitioners and researchers that the time was now, and we were ready to kind of answer that call.
And Nicole, I know that one of the driving principles, if you will, of this update has been transparency. And so, could you speak a little bit to that, the things that you've done to make sure that this process is as transparent as possible?
Yes, we've from the beginning said that this is a community driven process because we're listening to practitioners who are trying to employ the Universal Design for Learning UDL guidelines in a way that can really help them perceive barriers that might not be barriers for them and then design more inclusive environments. And it's their feedback that has driven the process, and we also want to make sure that feedback is a two-way street, that we are sharing with them where we are. And so, we've done our best to provide updates via newsletter, even this process of sharing the proposed draft guidelines first and then having it be available for public comment, unveiling it through a webinar that's available, recorded. But then every single piece of feedback Jenna and I have reviewed, we've coded, we've gone through, we've gone over. Really, we want to make sure that we help people understand that we are hearing them, we're reading what they're sharing, and we also need to ground this in the research. And so there is a balance there. And so when we shared the proposed update, we also shared the rationale for every single change so that people would understand why this was being proposed in a way that would strengthen and help UDL ultimately fulfill its purpose and promise for designing more inclusive learning experiences and environments.
Well, I just want to commend you and the teams that you've led because it's important to really live out your values. And I think you both have done that in guiding this process in terms of making it as inclusive as possible, right? We're talking about inclusion. Well, the process for updating the guidelines needs to be inclusive. So kudos on that. So whenever you announce that something new is coming, there's that period of time when people kind of, get alarmed because, they are practitioners and they've been practicing in a certain way for some time. So, Nicole, tell us what is remaining constant in the new version of the guidelines? What's remaining the same?
One thing that we have to reassure everyone is that UDL is still grounded in the neuroscience around how people learn. There is a fear that if we are looking at barriers to equitable learning, that this idea of equity somehow is not connected to neuroscience, but it absolutely is. And in the draft, and even more so in the final version that will be published, there will be articles for research, connections, examples, so that people understand just because we're considering barriers to equity does not mean that this is separated from the neuroscience. It's still very much grounded in that. And there's so much research, especially within the last 10 years, that's available that wasn't included as part of version 2.2, which is the one that we're using right now. The other thing that I think is going to stay the same, well, I know is staying the same, and hope folks understand this, is that there's still this real value of variability, this commitment to valuing variability. A difference is not a deficit. It is the environment that creates the conflicts and the barriers. And if we can design better environments, more inclusive environments by considering people who are most likely to be marginalized, excluded, or left out, we can ultimately design better experiences that everyone can benefit from. So I would say that commitment to variability, that valuing of variability is still very much a part of UDL guidelines version 3.0.
Thanks so much for clarifying that, Nicole. And definitely, we're just thinking about variability even in more variable ways, right? We're expanding the definition of variability with the updated guidelines. So I love that. So now that we've talked about what's remaining constant, maybe Jenna, you can give us a preview. What are some, if you're a UDL practitioner out there, what are like 2 or 3 major changes that they can anticipate?
I think we could start out maybe just kind of sharing some of those overarching themes in terms of updates and expansions. And I think that biggest piece that the guidelines 3.0 is really striving to do is emphasizing identity as part of variability. So Nicole was sharing how, that real emphasis on learner variability, that's staying the same, but we're expanding it now to really make sure that we're considering identity. And this grew out of a strong call from practitioners, from the research that we were exploring. And I can remember we were having lots of conversations. We had an incredible advisory board and a guidelines collaborative. And some of the conversations that came out of those groups was this idea that with the current version of the guidelines, we have multiple means of engagement that emphasizes the why. We have multiple means of representation that emphasizes the what. We have multiple means of action and expression that emphasizes the how, but that who was missing. And that was just conversations that kind of bubbled up really early on. And that just felt so striking to me. And it really resonated with a lot of other individuals who are a part of this process at the beginning, was we can do so much more to emphasize the who, that is just so important. So I think that was really kind of a driving theme with this update. I would say another goal from the very beginning was just to more explicitly acknowledge individual and institutional and systemic biases and think about how those are impacting teaching and learning. And then another interesting theme that really kind of bubbled up early on, again, from our meetings with our different advisory groups, and also from the focus groups that we were able to conduct really over 3 years, which was wonderful to be able to connect with so many individuals and learn from their perspectives. And many people shared with us that the idea of interdependence, or the importance of collective learning and collectively generating knowledge and learning from one another, seemed to feel kind of absent in the current version of the guidelines, and that we could do a lot more to make that more explicit. And some individuals would share with us, I think that idea of collective learning is implied. We can, see that in certain guidelines and checkpoints in the current version, but they had a hope that version 3.0 could do so much more to emphasize that importance of learning from one another and learning from one another's perspectives.
And I think if I could build on what Jenna is saying, on this idea of interdependence and collective learning, a theme was that also came through is that independence in of itself is not always the goal. That there's a value in working together. And one of our one of our young adult board members, so these are all young people between 18 and 22, and one of the members, well, several members do, but this member in particular communicates with an augmentative alternative communication device. Uh, she said, "I'm not less than because I need an aid to communicate. I'm not less than." And when we say everyone's goal is this idea of independence, that if you aren't quote unquote fully independent, then now you're somehow less than in someone's eyes. And this idea that we don't need help and can't benefit from help. And that's something that we hope when, the final update comes through, that people will be prompted to recognize the value of interdependence and collective learning, and not necessarily prioritize independence in of itself as the ideal way to be.
That's a great point to make. I mean, if you look at the world around us, interdependence is the way that we work, right? We're part of teams. We're part of sort of connected efforts to use knowledge to solve issues, right? Or solve problems in our society. So I'm glad that you emphasize that. And I'll insert myself here since I've been a small part of the update as well. I just have to say I'm really, really excited, as you mentioned, Jenna, the focus on identity. And I think about, for instance, the principle multiple means of representation. Right? We've talked about representation as like, let's use different formats. Let's use different options to sort of overcome the limitations of print. But there's another form of representation that's just as important. And it is, can you see yourself in the curriculum? Right? Is the curriculum a mirror of your experiences, of the concerns that you have, of the community that you're part of? And so I think that's really, really huge. And then the last thing, because I think you're going to be more engaged if you see yourself in the curriculum, right? But the last thing is, I guess you mentioned, we were talking about constant. Accessibility is going to be a constant. That's not going anywhere, right? It's always been a foundational component of UDL, and it's going to continue to be a foundational component of UDL. So if I could just insert myself into the story, as you if you will. Just wanted to highlight those few points. But I think it's just going to make our UDL guidelines connect to more people, to many more communities. And the fact is, the communities we serve are diverse and variable. And so the guidelines have to reflect that. So I don't know if either one of you wants to comment a little bit more on that.
I do. And I'm so excited that you shared the example about identity as part of multiple means of representation, how people and cultures are perceived. And yes, We are more engaged when we're able to perceive ourselves in the curriculum and see examples, especially ones that are authentic and not stereotypical. And even think about how people with disabilities are portrayed. Are they even seen in curriculum? And if the only time you see a person with a disability in a book that you read is To Kill a Mockingbird, there is a real problem. And it's also a problem for any student to not see that. We all need to see windows as well, because otherwise we start to ingrain stereotypical ideas about people and cultures. And so I think that's really important, because some people don't realize that it's a benefit for everyone to consider different perspectives and including them in the curriculum.
Yeah, I've always loved that idea of mirrors, windows, and sliding doors, right? That you should see yourself in the curriculum, but also the goal of education is to help you see beyond your current situation and to dream big dreams. And with UDL, we don't want to lessen the rigor. We want to open the door for you to dream big dreams and then make them reality. So I see UDL as a sliding doors, right? Providing all the options that you need to get to those dreams, to climb those mountains, if you will. So I know you've already thought about this quite a bit as you prepare to roll out the new updated UDL guidelines. What are some resources that you'll be making available? I think you hinted at this already, but to help practitioners start implementing this into their work. And maybe you can explain what's the timeline for the release.
So maybe I'll start out just sharing the timeline. So we were able to share our public draft in March, and then we had that period of public comment where we had surveys available for individuals to share feedback through April 15th. And that period was so incredibly helpful. We are just so grateful for the responses that we received from the community in terms of things people were excited about, and then also some really important pushback, some things that people had some concerns with. That was what this public period of comment or comment period was all about, this opportunity to learn from one another's feedback and their reactions to the draft. So we are just really grateful for the response there. And ever since then, Nicole and I have had the exciting and somewhat daunting task of trying to, pour over all of the feedback that we received. And we just took our jobs there so seriously to really make sure that we were carefully attending to all of the feedback that came in. We went through kind of an analysis process where we coded all of the feedback. And then we're really looking for themes and patterns that were bubbling up from the feedback, and using those themes and patterns alongside the research that we've been reviewing all along to make some final iterations to that public draft. And we'll be able to share Guidelines 3.0 this July at UDLCon, which is the conference that CAST will be hosting in Sacramento. So we just think this will be a wonderful way to kind of celebrate the launch of Guidelines 3.0. We're planning now to think about how we can do that in a public and inclusive way. So even if you're not able to join us at UDLCon, you'll still be able to be a part of that launch and celebration, because as we were sharing before, this really has been a community-driven effort. And so we're excited to be able to, celebrate with the community when we launch.
And Nicole, what are some of the tools that will support people in terms of the guidelines will be out there, right? We're looking forward to them. So if you're listening to this in the fall, they should be out there already for you to start digging into them. But what are some tools that you'll have available for people to really get up to speed on the new guidelines?
Yes. So, as Jenna was mentioning, the official launch is in July. And in July, what we will make available is most likely going to be an EPUB that gives a description of every guideline and some version of a checkpoint or consideration that goes with each guideline. And we'll provide the research behind that so that people can explore more. So, my day job is as CEO and founder of LessonCast. And to assist with the rollout, what we have offered is a series of online modules. It's kind of like a come in, explore, reflect, discuss with one another. And because we're still in the process of finalizing the actual updates, the modules are more around, have you thought about your identity as in your professional role? Have you thought about um, the bias that you may bring to a space, the assets that you may bring to a space? So those are really around exploring those concepts around um, learner identity, bias, interdependence, even concepts like, if some folks are struggling with, what do you mean joy and play in learning? Well, if you have questions about the role of joy and play in learning, come explore these resources. So those are available as a precursor, but then ongoing if people are just questioning some of the concepts and want to know more.
I love that. That gives us something to look forward to, right? As things get rolled out. But I think it's what you mentioned, Nicole, is really important. That there's some pre-work you can do, right? There's some pre-work as Jenna, you mentioned earlier, disrupting ableism, disrupting bias. That's work that kind of precedes that work with the guidelines themselves. So I'm really excited to hear about those resources that really get people engaged with like these deeper questions that have to do with your mindset as a practitioner, because that needs to change as well. And then that allows you in turn to really apply the UDL guidelines in a really thoughtful and impactful way. So I'm really excited for that. So as we get to the end here, I'll open up the floor. Is there anything else either one of you would like to add to this conversation? Let's start with you, Jenna. Anything else you want to add?
I just want to add a big thank you. As we've shared, this has been an incredibly collaborative process, that it has been community driven from the start. We have a way to sign up for a Guidelines 3.0 newsletter. And I think now we're over, the last time I checked, it was over 6,300 subscribers to that newsletter. And I think that's just like a beautiful symbol of the fact that this really has been a community effort. Nicole and I have had a chance to meet and connect with so many different people through this process and learn from them and learn from their ideas and their perspectives. And it feels really amazing to kind of be almost at the end of this process and think, we started 4 years ago hoping that we could create this community driven process. And now to almost be at the very end, we're not quite there. We still have some work ahead of us finalizing, but to almost be at the very end and think about all of the people who have been a part of this process and who have contributed just feels pretty amazing. So I'm ending our conversation now just feeling really grateful.
How about you, Nicole? Anything you would add?
Yes, and I would like to add, because I know I don't know how familiar your audience might be with Universal Design for Learning and how many of them might actually use UDL. And what I would like to add is an invitation. Sometimes folks think that UDL is just for teachers, whether it's primary, secondary, or higher ed, but it's really an approach to making any space or experience more accessible. And UDL is an invitation to think about who might be excluded via whether it's an enrollment program, where it's accessing on a website. And I think the beauty of UDL is that it helps us think beyond ourselves, because if left to my own devices, I will design the best experience for me because I know what works for me. And sometimes when we design, we forget the empathy for the other folks who are going to be experiencing the system. And UDL prompts us to think about, how can we make this better beyond our individual selves and make it more inclusive for everyone? And so if people are less familiar with UDL, know that I even apply UDL when planning my family vacations, because there's a lot of variability and we have a goal of everyone being happy and loving one another at least by the end, staying as a happy family. So I think that's the last thing that I would to share, and just also that the learning process is a journey. Sometimes folks say, "Oh, I've made it. I've arrived. I have my certificate now." But there's always something to unlearn and learn. So just thank you for having us here today.
Thank you both. It's been really a pleasure to have you both on the podcast, and we'll make sure to share in the show notes ways to keep up with the updates. As Jenna mentioned, a great way would be to sign up for that newsletter, which I can't believe more than 6,000 people. So there's definitely a hunger out there to learn more about how do we make our learning more inclusive. I'll finish with this last thought. For me, this is really meaningful, this update, because when I came into the field of UDL, I got it. I got it from a neuroscience perspective, but I didn't get it from a Luis perspective or a person with a disability perspective because I didn't really see myself in the guidelines at that time. So I just want to commend you both and the teams that you've led, everybody who's been involved with this update, because I finally can see myself in the guidelines as a person with a disability and somebody who does this work, but this is not just work for me. It's a passion. It's something that I live every day. And so I just want to end by saying thank you for leading such an inclusive, accessible effort that really mirrors the values of what this field is all about. So, so excited for this launch. And we better end the podcast now before we all start crying. So thank you, everyone, for listening. And again, stay tuned. More to come on the UDL guidelines. This is going to really change the field for the better. So thank you both for being with us on the Accessible Learning Experience. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Accessible Learning Experience, brought to you by the National Center on Accessible Educational Materials at CAST. You can find us on the web at aem.cast.org. There you'll find show notes with links to all of the resources mentioned on each episode. Thanks again for listening, and remember, accessibility is everyone's responsibility. The contents of this podcast were developed under a cooperative agreement with the U.S. Department of Education. However, those contents do not necessarily represent the policy of the U.S. Department of Education, and you should not assume endorsement by the federal government.